Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. My name is Juan Thomas, Chair of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Section. Welcome to our weekly Chair Chat. Today, I am so honored to welcome as our guest an active member and leader of our section, Mr. Michael Santos, who is the Associate Director of Results based in Washington, D.C. Michael, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me, Juan.
Michael, we're here to talk about the renter's tax credit today, but I first want to ask you, tell me a bit about your role at Results and what does Results stand for? What does Results do?
Sure. So a bit about myself. I've been working in housing and homelessness policy since about 2015. Before I joined Results, I was actually an eviction defense attorney in the city and county of San Francisco, California. I was part of a cohort of right to counsel attorneys providing full scope legal representation to tenants getting evicted in San Francisco housing court. So full scope meaning from like the moment that a tenant receives an eviction notice up until they settle the case or the case goes to trial. We provide full scope legal representation. So I'm also a proud alum of the National Homelessness Law Center, formerly known as the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, where I worked on federal homeless policies on the education of homeless children and youth. The Law Center, I believe, was actively involved and continues to contribute to the work of the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. So that's a bit about me and the work I do at Results. So Results is a national grassroots lobbying organization that creates the public and the political will to end poverty by empowering individuals to exercise their political and personal power for change. So we support a network of more than 90 chapters with over 650 active volunteers across the country and an additional about 25,000 members in our broader email action network. So our grassroots, right, this is a diverse set of stakeholders across the country, your average Americans, educate members of Congress, they work with the media, they do public, they get their pieces published, letters to the editors, op-eds, and they also build awareness within their communities on housing programs and policies, basic nutrition and health programs, along with budget and tax policies, which I'm really excited to talk to you about today. So our grassroots network includes a specific focus on engaging young leaders and elevating the voices of Americans who have firsthand lived experience of poverty.
Mike, I want to thank you for your work in this important space. As you know, the theme of this year for our section has been economic justice, and you're doing that work every day. As you know better than I could even articulate at this point, the importance of housing for families, for people, basic needs. You're doing the work at the ground level, really doing the policy and the advocacy work that's necessary to promote the importance of housing, clean housing, safe neighborhoods. So I want to thank you for that, for your work in that space. And so this year, we've been working as a section with the renter's tax credit issue. Could you tell us what that is, kind of define that term and explain what that issue is all about?
Sure, I know it's a mouthful, it's a handful, but let's break it down a little bit because there's like multiple terms built into that phrase, right? Renter tax credit. So let's start with the tax credit part first, right? So a tax credit is a mechanism built into the tax system, and it changes the way the government counts the money you owe, right? And often this is what helps taxpayers like us get a bump in the refund that we get, or reduce the amount that we owe the federal government or the state government for that matter. And contrast that to a tax deduction, which reduces the income that can be taxed by the government. So tax credits typically help people who are lower income, whereas tax deductions, by the nature of how it gets, it reduces the income, typically benefits people who are wealthier, people who have more assets. And the most famous, I think, in the context of housing, right, the most famous tax deduction is the mortgage interest deduction. So we don't actually have a federal renter tax deduction. So the other thing that I wanted to point out on the tax credit side is that, tax credits generally is like fungible, right? It gives households and taxpayers the flexibility, the choice in how they spend their money to meet their needs. For some, it could be finding new housing, so they could be closer to family, to friends, to be closer to better schools or to work. Or in the case of domestic violence survivors, to find safe housing away from their abuser. So all of this to say, like, you had pointed out, we are working on economic justice, but I see this also as economic justice. It's just a form of racial justice. It's a form of gender justice. It's a form of other forms of addressing injustices in our society. So for others, it could also be to afford the current home that they're living in, so they don't actually have to move. So one way to think about a renter tax credit, which many people actually are not familiar with, is that if you're familiar with the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit, these are tax credits that are already in existence, either on the state level, but certainly on the federal level, is that it expands and extends those tax credits that specifically targets renters, right? I think the limitation of the child tax credit, for example, is that it's only, you can get the child tax credit if you are a family with children. But in reality, right, like we also have low-income renters, low-income households who do not have kids. And so they can't take advantage of the child tax credit. And so this is where we see the renter tax credit could play a role in filling in that gap. So as I had mentioned before, like there is no federal renter tax credit. There's no federal renter tax deduction either. But some states already have, a state level renter tax credit in place. The problem with state level renter tax credit is that they're largely, piecemeal. There's like a patch of across the country. Different states have it, probably close to about like, nearly half the states have some type of mechanism that targets renters in their tax code, but all of them are still insufficient, right? Take California, for example. California has a renter tax credit that if you meet the income threshold, if you make a certain income, you get a whopping $50 per year in a state that has a very, very high cost of living. Like $50 is actually not going to take you anywhere in San Francisco City, for example.
Right.
So state level renter tax credit, they vary by eligibility. They have different amounts. They have different structures. Some are refundable. The renter tax credit is really a tax credit that would keep housing affordable for many renters across the country. So renters who may be eligible can get the tax credit if they pay more than 30% of their income. So the goal of the renter tax credit is to subsidize people and assist those households who are low income and are what we consider as rent burden, right? Rent burden is like if you're making, if you're spending more than 30% of your monthly income towards rent, you're considered rent burden.
So you referenced the child's tax credit that was put in place a few years ago. And there's been those who argue to lift people out of poverty, it should continued. Could you kind of compare or contrast how the renter's tax credit can also do that same work of lifting people out of poverty?
Yeah, so and I think this is like what makes the renter tax credit so appealing is that we've seen the anti-poverty effects of the child tax credit. The child tax credit, when we had the advanced child tax credit in 2021, which was passed under the American Rescue Plan Act, it made the tax credit available on a monthly basis for the first 6 months, meaning that families who were eligible to get that tax credit were getting it on a monthly basis. And it's a huge boost if you qualify and are able to take advantage of the child tax credit. So the renter tax credit will essentially function close to what the child tax credit is. And to my earlier point, it really expands it and extends it in a way that makes those families without children, those households, single head of households, for example, eligible for a tax credit that subsidizes, their rent. If they're making more than 30% of their, if they're spending more than 30% of their income towards their monthly rent, they're considered rent burdened, they would be able to get the renter tax credit. Now, going back to my earlier point, we had talked about fungibility, right? Tax credits generally are fungible, right? So I think on the local, on the grassroots level, on the personal level, most people don't really compartmentalize how they spend the tax credits that they get from the from the federal government, right? A tax credit is a tax credit. And again, it's fungible. And so we hear a lot of stories on the ground where families who were eligible for the child tax credit were able to use some of that credit, some of that child allowance is what we call it, towards paying for rent, towards paying for food, so that their family will have a shelter, will have a place to stay, or will have food to eat for the next, several weeks or several months. And so we see the potential of the renter tax credit as well, similar to what had happened during the 2021 Advanced Child Tax Credit Scheme, as a potential for the tax code to really lift people out of poverty and make housing more affordable.
So you mentioned the tax code. Why do we target the tax code? Why is this important on a federal level versus on a state-by-state level? And
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we had talked about this earlier already, right? Like some of the existing tax credits for renters on the state level are, again, piecemeal, patchwork, and they're not enough, right? Some states actually limit eligibility for people with disabilities, for people who are seniors. And so for us, that's really a symptom of, helping seniors and people with disabilities is great, right? And it's an acknowledgement that, those populations with limited income cannot survive based on that limited income that they have. They need additional assistance to actually be able to afford their housing. They need additional assistance to prevent from getting evicted, or for preventing them from experiencing homelessness. And so in a way, we need a federal tax code so that, when you move from one state to another, it doesn't mean like you're kind of losing out if one state has a renter tax credit and the other doesn't. And we need additional solutions to other existing interventions, right? We need a more equitable tax code that works for the people, particularly low income households. We need a tax code that is responsive to the needs of the public, including those who are rent burdened, right? People who are spending more than 30% of their income towards rent. Many people actually spend more than that, right? Like they spend 50% or more of their income towards rent on a monthly basis. And those who are living paycheck to paycheck, right? Like those who are like one financial emergency away from experiencing housing instability or homelessness. The other thing is that existing housing and homelessness programs are insufficient. And again, they don't work for everyone, right? Think of, for example, of that, the household living paycheck to paycheck. For those households, they're barely getting by. And again, one financial emergency from losing their housing or going hungry. So they don't really have time to apply for the program. So why not use the tax code to meet them where they're at? Right. And the narrative that we're actually getting on the ground is that many people who have lost their housing are still working. They're very much part of the tax system in this country. And so there is a potential to be able to reach those vulnerable communities, vulnerable populations through the tax code. Right. And lastly, we need a couple of things. Like we need additional solutions to increasing the supply of affordable housing. And I think the tax code could be used for that. And as to my earlier point, right, like state and local actions to address affordable housing overall, it's just not enough. We need a federal intervention.
So, Michael, you have been a critical member of the leadership this year for our section around this conversation. You were a panelist for our Economic Justice Summit back in March at Georgetown, where we talked about this and many other issues around economic justice. And as a result of those conversations and other work within our section this year, we had a task force established with the tax law section, and you were part of that task force. And we're putting together a resolution to present to the ABA House of Delegates this summer in our annual meeting in August about renters tax credit. Could you give us kind of the highlights of that resolution and what you hope to see will come out of that resolution if it passes the House this summer?
Sure. So the resolution really urges, like different levels of government to amend existing laws or enact new laws to provide financial support to tenants of rental housing. And that includes, is not limited to just like the renter tax credit that we just talked about, right? It talks broadly more about the refundable tax credits for low income renters. That includes restoring the advanced child tax credit that I had alluded to earlier, expanding the earned income tax credit and the low income housing tax credit, right? And again, because of the nature of tax credits writ large, right, they're all fungible. These are all tax credits that could benefit renters. And we need more to actually address the affordable housing crisis that we're in at the moment.
So if this resolution becomes ABA policy, then we can advocate on behalf of the American Bar Association in the halls of Congress and partner with other allies, such as Results, to advocate for these type of changes in the tax code.
Absolutely. I mean, the ABA has recognized, the fundamental right, human right to housing for all, right? An essential step to realizing adequate housing for all is to ensure affordability. And to achieve that goal, the ABA has adopted policies in the past that enable individuals and families to meet basic, life necessities by recognizing and promoting a human right to basic income and living wage for all employees to meet a basic standard of living, right? And it's so unfortunate that we're in this situation that wages haven't kept up with the rise in rents and house prices, right? So ABA policy recognizes economic hardship and its effect on renters. So the renter tax credit and support for tax credits that benefit low-income renters, low-income households across the country is just an extension of the work that the ABA is already doing.
Wonderful. Tax policy and tax law is a very specialized area. And many lawyers who don't work in that space, quickly let people know, well, I'm not a tax attorney, and really don't get involved in learning those issues. But could you help us with kind of opening up our perspective on how can lawyers who don't practice in this area, who don't work in this area, how can we be helpful in advocating for better tax policy? Are there resources out there that you would recommend that we read or watch to educate ourselves on issues around tax policy?
Sure. Let me step back a little bit because I think on the grassroots level, there's so much work that needs to be done to make the tax code accessible, right? Through the substantive policy, making it actually, accessible to low-income renters and low-income households, but also to appeal to the broader public, right? Like, for lack of a better description, like, how do we make the tax code, the tax policy sexy and interesting to the public, right? Like, that's the biggest, that's the billion-dollar question I'm trying to, and right? Most people are intimidated by the tax code for different reasons, right? It's too complicated. Oh, they're afraid that they'll owe taxes to the government, which is, always my fear when I file my taxes, right? They only follow what the tax app that they're using is telling them to do when they file their taxes, right? Like, when you get your tax forms from your employer, usually there's the boxes are numbered, and so that makes it easier when you actually file your own taxes. So most people also don't really worry about taxes until the time comes to file their taxes around April of every year. So it's not so much on the mainstream consciousness of the public, except once a year. Yet we know that the tax code, because the tax code was not really built originally to benefit poor people, it was and still is a mechanism that benefits largely wealthy people and corporations. And yet we've seen its potential, as we discussed earlier, to lift people out of poverty, to keep them stably housed. So this is where lawyers can play an important role, not just like educating themselves about, the tax code or the benefits of the tax code, but also doing programming and webinars on economic justice under our tax system, developing further scholarship in this area, right? Most people don't pay attention to the intersection between housing and tax, for example, and educating Congress, lawmakers, and other stakeholders and advocates on these issues. Now, to answer your question about resources, hoping that we can share after this webinar, after this session, some resources, including our website. We are currently we're wrapping up our Set the Agenda campaign, where our grassroots are meeting with their members of Congress, some of which are face-to-face, to educate them about, the tax code and why it's so important to achieve economic justice using the tax code. And that includes our work around pushing for a renter tax credit.
And what is your website? for our listeners?
Yes, I'm sorry. The website is www.results.org.
Okay. And how can we find you on that website as well, or do you have different contact information?
Absolutely. You'd be able to find me as part of the staff. Again, as you had mentioned earlier, I'm the associate director. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I'm hoping that there's a way that we can, make my email available for those of you, watching or listening this session. If you want to reach out to me, have specific questions about renter tax credit or achieving economic justice through the tax code overall, happy to answer that as well.
I appreciate you sharing your website and those resources. I also want to throw out, as you well remember, during our Economic Justice Summit, we had a lecture and a conversation with Dorothy Brown, professor at Georgetown. Her book, The Whiteness of Wealth, that talks about the history of the tax code, is also another important resource to understand the history and the way the tax code's been used to really also keep certain vulnerable communities in poverty as well. So I think that's a book people should also think about adding to their summer reading list if you've not read that book already. And speaking of books, Michael, tell us, what book are you reading these days, or what's the last book you read?
So I'm currently reading White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color. So when I was actually in college, I was a biomedical engineer, but I was also I studied critical race theory, and I really fell in love with pursuing that. That's probably why I ended up doing public interest law after college, after law school. And right now, one of the things I'm working on at Results is really, figuring out how to lead a campaign that centers people with lived experience of homelessness and or poverty, right? We had talked about how the tax system has excluded people living in poverty in the past. And so, how do we build a coalition? How do we build solidarity across racial lines, across economic lines, across different lines for that matter, so that we can be a force to reckon with and make these important changes to the tax code? So again, we have a lot of work to do, and hopefully that we can have other advocates join us in this effort.
Right, so important. Michael, you do such important work that is very intellectually stimulating and rigorous. You're dealing with serious policy matters, but I hope you also relax from time to time and have some fun. What do you do for fun when you're not working on changing the tax code?
So I am an outdoor runner. I love running outside. I'm also a gardener. I actually used to live in co-housing here in Washington, D.C., and also in California. And at that time, when I lived in co-housing, I actually designed and built our compost system. So oddly enough, I really love being outside. When I was in California, we also had a land big enough to have chickens in our garden. So it was really, really fun to, hang out with the chickens while I was gardening. But
you really can't do that in DC? Is that what you're saying?
It's tightly regulated here in DC, and you really need the consent of all your neighbors before you can even start a chicken coop.
Right. It's funny. I know two people that have moved from Washington to California, and one of them, and it's quick. They both say they have nothing in common. My last question to you, my friend, is this: if you could wake up tomorrow and be anything but a lawyer, what would you be and why?
As I mentioned before, I'd either be a gardener or a farmer. I really, really love growing my own crops. I really love being outdoors. I really love planting things. I have a huge collection of indoor plants. So one of the unfortunate things of having to move from California to DC recently is that we don't have a lot of outdoor space, right? Living in a densely populated neighborhood in DC means that I don't have the luxury of having a huge outdoor garden, let alone an outdoor balcony space. And so I'm stuck with having indoor plants. And so, if I ever have to be besides a lawyer, I'd probably be a gardener or a farmer.
Well, I've spent a lot of time in the DC metro area over the years, and it sounds like you may have to move to Maryland or Virginia because there is open space in those two states. if you want to stay up there.
Right. Yes. There's a lot of land. But again, I think one of the things that trips me up is that across the board, housing is very expensive. Whether you're renting or
Yes,
you're a homeowner,
that's true.
it's really pricey.
That's true. That's true. Michael, I want to thank you for your work. I want to thank you for your advocacy and your leadership. I also want to thank you again for your leadership in our section. You are an invaluable member of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section. We truly appreciate you, and thank you for being my guest today.
Thanks, Juan. And thanks for having me here.